Hi, I'm Nala Donato, artist and designer, and it's time for another sketchbook tour. No intro this time because I think this is going to be a long one, so let's just dive straight in. If this sketchbook looks familiar, it's because I already made a video about it when I was about halfway done, talking about why I made a sketchbook, what techniques I'm using in the sketchbook, how it's helping me release perfectionism, and so on. So if you want to make a sketchbook similar to that one, I recommend watching this video. And this one is going to be focused mostly on eye candy. So on the first page, this is actually the color of the original page, this mustard yellow. And I thought it would be a lovely backdrop for a portrait with water-soluble crayons. So most of the portraits in here are me using water-soluble crayons and pencils. That's basically most what I've been doing mostly with my portraits lately. And this here is a recycled image from more than 10 years ago, probably. I did some tree studies in charcoal, so I cut up one in half and glued it in, added some more branches here, and this raven here is basically to cover up my address because I always put a sticker with my address on my sketchbooks in case I lose them. So it's just for privacy reasons. And this is a very loose doodle made with a brush pen, holding it on at the very end, so it doesn't look like much, but it was just a bit of fun while watching TV. And this is a page with lots of layers, and on top of it is just some paint marker and colored pencils for this like lotus pattern. And this is one of my favorite spreads in the sketchbook. So this is one of the most recent pages from a few days ago, and this one is from 2021. So I don't work in this sketchbook in order. I just skip based on what the background was and based on what I'm most inspired to do. So this is one of my favorite pages. It was one that basically started this whole series of drippy portraits and other drippy stuff like this rose right here. So I want to just get into some of the lessons that I learned or things that I've discovered using this sketchbook. And this spraying with water into a water soluble crayon or pencil was a really amazing discovery for me. I had so much fun with it. And this is one of my favorite portraits that I've done lately because it was very spontaneous. I had no idea what was going to happen. I was just spraying into this hair area and this texture here. I would not know how to recreate that, even if I tried. It was really a happy surprise. And that kind of helps me to add this little chaotic, spontaneous element to my art because normally I'm very precise with my drawings and paintings. And it's not for the lack of trying. I just don't like, doing messy stuff with my own hands. I don't enjoy that even for a little bit. But just adding some spraying to my otherwise precise drawings kind of helps me offset that and have some unpredictable, uncontrolled element that can look really cool occasionally. So this would normally be just a very boring rose study. But because I used some spraying and did a bit of, smudging in the background, I think it looks much better than it did originally. But of course, it may not be everyone's cup of tea, but it happens to be mine. So that's one of the things that I took into my other sketchbooks and even some of my artwork. And I think I'm going to keep using that in the future as well. So if I didn't mention it, it's basically water-soluble crayons and pencils on transparent gesso. And here in the background, you can see a bit of that book page showing through. So that's some of the techniques that work really well for me. Now, this, on the other hand, I didn't really enjoy, and I don't think when I started using this sketchbook, I started off with very dark, bright, intense backgrounds, and then I quickly realized I don't know what to do with them. It's really difficult to draw anything else over them. I did test some white ink here, so there's that at least. Now this is an unfinished page. This was just the page where I was sharpening my crayon. This was another one of those where the background is a bit darker. And okay, so this one did have a lot of white. So I was able to kind of see a silhouette of a hooded figure here and drew this. I call this one the cultist. And here I wasn't able to do much. So I just drew this very dark silhouettes of ghosts. So that's when you have a very dark background. It's really hard to work with it, for me personally. So just another portrait study from reference, not a very successful one. A page of doodles with a brush pen and some white gel pen. And this is a very layered page. So in the very first layer, I used scraps from my calligraphy practice. And this calligraphy ink is not waterproof, unfortunately. But I found a way to protect it, preserve it, by using either matte medium or transparent gesso. So it kind of, it does leak a bit. It does become a bit fuzzy, but afterwards, when you add stuff on top of it, it doesn't leak so much. Well, here it did a bit, but here it remained fine. So I kept using this in my other artwork as well, as I have a ton of these practice sheets that I don't know what to do with. So it becomes useful as like collage material for some mixed media artworks. And I realized that if you paint over acrylic medium or transparent gesso on both sides of the paper, then it becomes preserved so you can reuse it without destroying the original lettering. So I used water-soluble crayons here and here. And here I have a bit of ink and white gel pen. So these two pages are both covered with black gesso. I have a couple of pages here where I went wild with black gesso, and then also found out that it's really difficult to work with with black gesso if you don't have a good plan what to do with it. So here I did use some white ink for these ornaments, and that looks really nice with a lot of contrast. And the crayon is just opaque enough to show up with vibrant color. But not all colors are equally opaque. Sometimes it really doesn't show really well against a black. So this portrait, okay, it's kind of has a glare from the light, but if you look at it under a different angle, it is really dark. It's not very, it's just not what I intended to do with it, but I had a lot of difficulty working with this. So again, I realized that black gesso, as cool as it looks, sometimes it's just really impractical for this techniques which I'm using here. This page was originally painted in orange, and then I went over with these little landscape. And here I doodled a bit with a white gel pen and white crayon and just added a bit of that vignette. So these intense colors can sometimes work, but sometimes get a bit difficult. And this is actually what my favorite backgrounds are. So here you can see a bit of that tan background, and here there's a bit of that medium gray. And these are great because for tan backgrounds, if you're drawing a light-skinned portrait, it's basically your mid-tone. You just need to add some shadows and highlights, and it's this one I drew really, really quickly. Normally, it takes me a long time to draw a portrait, but here when you have the majority of the work already done with a mid-tone, I was able to complete it in like 15, 20 minutes, which is crazy. And then I just add a bit of intense contrasting background so that it doesn't look washed out, which toned backgrounds sometimes can be. And here, now the good thing is that here the colors are really intense. They're really opaque, so you can barely see that gray background from underneath. And here, I utilize this spray technique where I just sprayed into a finished drawing. And that is a very scary moment when you don't know what's going to happen. Like you could have just sprayed in the opposite direction for all I know. because that kind of thing did happen to me in the past. But I guess my aim was right, so it did go downwards to kind of resemble a stream of tears. This is another one with water-soluble crayons, but here was mostly doing the smudging with my fingers over, I think it was like basically just glue. And this is, I think, Stabilo All pencil, because I realized that that pencil works quite well over crayon. Other pencils that I have, not so well. And here, more butterflies. This is a collaged book page. And I painted in the silhouette shape of the butterfly with white acrylic so that the lettering doesn't show through. And then went over that with a water-soluble pencil and some black ink. So it's a really strong contrast. And the background is water-soluble crayons. If I don't mention what the what the technique is, you can basically assume that it's water-soluble crayon because that's 90% of the sketchbook. And here the original background is kind of this gradient from red, purple, blue, violet. And so I just added shadows and highlights on top of that. And then a bit of red to the background. And this is tracing paper that I stuck in with some washi tape. And so this is a little pastel doodle, and this is paint marker. And originally these pages both are covered with gesso and then watercolor. But the colors are very irregular and very intense, and it's really difficult to draw anything figurative on top of that because you can't really cover up that background with anything. And so here I just did some sticking in some bits of decorative paper and again a bit of crayon and spraying. And here I just doodled some botanical looking things with a gel pen and some more crayon. So this is not normally what I draw, but I really found myself with so many pages that I had no idea what to do with, so I resort to doodling when I don't know what else to do. Here, the page originally started just by wiping off my leftover paint from some other work and just stuck in this little pine drawing. And here was just blending some colors with my fingers. Also with water, because you wouldn't have such a uniform surface otherwise. And this is another one of those problematic pages with very dark violet background where no matter how hard you push, it's still not gonna be this very strong contrast and like a smooth coverage that I like in my portraits. So that's why I stopped painting pages in those dark colors, and I'm not going to do that in the future. It just doesn't work well. And this is just a little experiment smudging different skin tones with very vibrant colors. And this page, again, entirely covered with black gesso, and this one was partly covered with black gesso. Then I added some wax crayon and some watercolor here. And for the longest time, I had no idea what to do with it. Then I decided to do some Raven studies to use the black backdrop essentially as a positive shape for the birds themselves. And when you have a black subject, then the black backdrop really comes in useful because you don't have a lot of work to do to draw in the features. Here just lightly indicated the highlights with white and blue crayon on both of these. And here I just drew the skull with gouache and then covered up the shadows with crayons. So that was fine as well to get a bit of that contrast. But now I prefer to do it vice versa, to draw the shape of the object on white paper and then cover the remaining areas with black gouache or something else that would add that contrast. But overall, I like this page. This red came out really nice, except it's catching the glare from the light. So let me show you this way. It looks much more accurate this way, like the red glow. So I really like that, how aesthetic it is. And these are my favorite colors after all. So this is another page where I started off with gesso and watercolor. And here I was following along these silhouettes that showed up in the paint. So I just basically outlined what I was seeing, like like the Rorschach images. You see a shape and then you kind of add features to it. And you get a bit of like dream imagery. And here I drew this passion flower with soft pastels. Now another page of doodles. This is brush pen over acrylic background. And this is a super old flower study when I was just practicing how to paint with watercolor. So I did a lot of these flower studies. I have a couple more here. And I glued that in and just blended that with some water-soluble crayon for this kind of gradient effect. And here's just a really quick portrait drawing, not very realistic or anything, over a watercolor background. And this was originally a watercolor background, and then I painted in negative shapes with water-soluble crayon, and then just added a bit of highlight and shadow with some water-soluble pastels and pencils. So that can work for this very kind of designy look, minimalist look. Now this is just a very loose portrait sketch. I was also holding my brush pen at the very end, so I was getting these very flowy lines that normally I don't really do in that way, but I've tried to kind of experiment with that to add kind of a bit more organic look to my drawings with ink. So I'm really happy with how that turned out. I added a bit of crayon for the background and a bit of highlights and shadows. Originally, the page was this tan color with watercolor paint. And this was a study that didn't really work out, so let's move on. Now, these two pages are both water-soluble crayon over acrylic, and I know that here I also used a lot of that spraying effect. So I drew the skull and then sprayed into it, so it kind of all these drips happening, and I love that. I really like how that turned out. And this also has some drippy effect, but I don't really remember what I did here. Did I only spray the background, or did I also spray this figure? I'm not sure. Now this page has a ton of stuff going on because I essentially use this as a practice page or as a testing page for this texture paste that I handmade. So I used gesso and the white baby powder to get this texture piece to use with stencils. And then one was too runny. So these were very runny. This was a bit too thick, so it turned out very high. And this one was just perfect. So I used that on a different painting, a mixed media painting. So that's why I needed to test how that works before I used it on the actual painting. But then I went over that with lots of color, lots of watercolor, gesso, what have you. So these are just some invented symbols that looked a bit like an alien keyboard. So I drew this because I thought that was appropriate. And this little bat here is probably 15-ish years old. I know this was from when I was still in university, so that was quite a while ago. And it was just in my pile of scraps that I have around my studio. So I stuck it in here to give him a permanent home. And that's like my favorite part of this page is this bat over the moon. And this originally, I just saw this kind of like a skeletal shape in the colors that were kind of blending in the background. So I highlighted it with some more shading and so on. So it's not really intended as a specific character or shape, but that's how it turned out. And this is a piece of packaging that I collected from throwing in the trash. So I have a lot of these little cardboard pieces that I like because they have this like off-white background that white can look really nice on. I think they're also good backgrounds for, especially for like figures or portraits. So I have a bit of that in the sketchbook further on. And this was originally a charcoal study based on a photo. And then I sprayed it with fixative and then covered it with transparent gesso and then colored it with water soluble crayon. And I love how that technique works. I think that could be useful if I do any figure studies in the future, that I could actually use that as a kind of an element in mixed media artwork. And this originally, the background is this orangey red, and that I actually just added some highlights and shadows with water soluble pastels and then made the background this contrasting blue. So that kind of works. I like this page. Now these two pages I had no idea what to do with. They started off as black gesso on both pages, and then I added this circular brush shapes with white and these kind of wavy lines also with white, and then covered this one in blue and this one in red, and it just stayed there for months without no idea what to do. And then I realized that this one kind of looks a bit like celestial, like starry, you know, and this one looks a bit like otherworldly, underworldly, let's say it. So I thought it was very appropriate to draw like an angelic figure and a demonic figure on the opposite sides. So that's basically the story of this page, just trying to be inspired by the background. But sometimes it can take a long time for inspiration to strike. So that's a bit of a frustrating element with this sketchbook, where a lot of these pages remained empty for a long time because I had no idea what to do with them. Now this is a little monster, and originally I drew this one and I thought, wow, it's really cute, but it's very sad. Why is it so sad? And so I drew it here a bit happier. This one may actually look a bit creepy now, but at least the monster is happy. So originally both pages had this dark red acrylic background, or carmine red. And these two failed portraits. Now this one was actually going quite well until I ruined one area of the image and I really couldn't go back. So just sprayed the entire portrait with water and let it drip so you can see like a ghostly image of that one. Which is fine, I guess. It served its purpose. Now this page is covered with some napkins or paper napkins or paper towels. And again, just covered it with a bunch of watercolor, had no idea what to do with it, and then I saw kind of this shape that resembled a profile, and that's why I drew this face, just added a bit more detail to it. And this background was also originally kind of colorful with purple and red, and so I added this portrait with water-soluble crayon and a bit of pattern with crayon. Now this page and a couple of following pages are very thick because I glued in several pages together, so they have this very cardboardy feeling. This, just a bunch of throwing stuff on, nothing interesting. And this was the outline of my hand that I just colored in with water-soluble crayons. And here I glued in a piece of packaging that had a really nice pattern. So I went on to kind of repeat the general shape of the pattern. And this here is a little window with a bird feather attached here. So the original background of both of these are just some book pages collaged in and then covered with this textured acrylic paint, and then added some more like shading and detail with water-soluble pastel. And the same thing on this side. And this is the last page that I completed just last night. So I had no idea what to do with this page. And then I just added the shape of the window and some doodling just to be done with it, really. Here, again, both of these pages had this very strong purpley magenta background. And this was just an experiment. I painted in the sky shape and the mountain shape with water-soluble crayon. And when I sprayed it, it just flowed down and made this shape that looks kind of like a river. And so I just left it like that. I thought, nope, this doesn't need anything else. It's perfect as it is. And here we're just doodling with paint marker and some ink. Just a little doodle over painter's tape. And this is actually the leftover from my original planner. And these two pages are blind contour drawings. So if you've never done blind contour drawings, that's basically when you look at the source. So you look either at a photo or a person or an object, and you keep looking at that object while you're drawing on the paper. And you have no idea what you're doing because you can't see what your hand is doing, but you're basically trying to follow the shapes that you see. So this one turned out very wonky. But I am actually quite pleased with how this one turned out. It actually looks like a caricature. So yeah, that was a really cool exercise, but I keep forgetting to do that more often. So here, another bit of glued in paper with this kind of yellowish color. And here, just a bunch of feet from observation. And then I added here a bunch of eyes from imagination because I wasn't feeling particularly attached to the studies of feet. This was a technique that I used. I learned it from Juliana Coles. She has a little class that was basically kind of an image that keeps changing shape as you go over it with layers and layers of stuff. And then you get this really weird, surreal mess. And that was fun, but I didn't keep on using this technique in the future. Now, this was, I believe, a bit of art therapy process. And here I found a piece of handmade collage paper. So that's basically when you just dump a bunch of acrylic paint on some junk paper. And I saw that it had the shape of a heart. And since I'm really obsessed with hearts, like the hearts that resemble an actual human heart, I just stuck it here and left it like that. I don't think it needs anything else. This was another bit of art therapy with water-soluble pencil. And this originally was a drawing on a page covered with gesso, and then I covered it with tea bags. I have a bunch of dried tea bags. I thought would come in useful with some mixed media, but it covered up the entire drawing. I could barely see it. So I did add some details on top of it. So it has this kind of partially transparent appearance. And this are some magazine images glued into and a little colored pencil, or no, this is, yeah, there's some colored pencil, there's some water-soluble crayon portrait study. And this was one of my old business cards. I think it was the last remaining business card that I had, and I just cut it in half and glued it here. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. So these were just some leftovers from the magazine page that I covered the page with, and just some doodling. And here, kind of very doodly crayon portrait. And this was an attempt of a sugar skull as a wax resist. So that's basically when you take a white or another kind of light crayon that is non-soluble, so just your basic oil or wax pastel. You draw it with a really thick layon, so it really gets into the paper, and then cover it with a dark wash, like a dark watercolor. And so here I did several layers of Payne's Gray watercolor, and then the white sticks out really nicely. So if you wanted something more of a simple motive, you can do that, and it looks like very grungy. But I do use that technique when I'm drawing studies of landscapes, especially for rocks or for like sea foam and stuff like that, that I don't have to have it be very precise, but more of a texture. That's really useful. And here I was just swatching on white gesso. Now this is another one of those pages that remained unfinished, and it could still be unfinished, but I don't know if I'll come back to it. Maybe I will in a couple of months' time. We'll see. So these are layers and layers of papers from just scraps I have around the studio, acrylic paint, gesso, what have you, and then I just drew these silhouettes and covered the outside area with black gesso. So I could theoretically still write on this or draw features, but I'm not sure if I'm going to do that because I'm kind of done. And this is a lot. So there are, at the bottom there was a map, but it's no longer visible at all. You can't see any original writing on it. And first I cleaned my palette after doing a mixed media painting, which I did record. There's a cat mixed media painting that I have in my ArtChat archive. So I had a lot of these blue and green, and I just painted the entire page with this blue and green, and then added some dark areas. And then I was testing more of that texture paste. So here I was just more like writing into the paste with a sharp object. And here is a little paw stencil that I made based on the actual paw print of our late family cat. So that was an element of that painting. So I tested that stencil here to see how it works. And these blingy, shiny elements are silver stamp ink. I just went over it with a stamp pad to get the areas of the relief that are towards, poking out, to catch that, to make it a bit more pronounced. Bit of sheet music from my old music classes, and another flower study. I mentioned earlier that I had a lot of these flower studies that I'm sticking into my sketchbooks, kind of as a collage element. So yeah, that's this page. I thought initially that I would add some doodles or some scribbling to it, but I thought, you know what, I'm just going to leave it like this. These two pages are some cardboard packaging. I mentioned I like to use cardboard packaging to draw on. So I was testing out some new colored pencils, and these are kind of like, I don't know, demonic, vampiric creatures. Now here they're kind of rubbing together, so that black is coming over on this page. So I was just testing out different skin tones with these colored pencils that I have. And then I had some leftover acrylic paint. And usually when I have leftover acrylic paint, I either paint in a new background or I go over the edges of a sketchbook page. This was another portrait study from reference. Originally a tan background. Now this model looked quite light in the photo, so I'm not sure if that's the original person's skin tone. But again, it looked fine on this tan background, and then I just added some black gouache to kind of make a bigger contrast. It's mostly colored pencil and some white crayon and white gouache on the very lightest highlights. And this was also originally tan background. Just a sketch of a figure with a brush pen, and then water-soluble crayon for highlights and shadows, and then water-soluble crayon for the red background so that the figure stands out. Okay, it's better now that the glare isn't showing up. This was another piece of paper that actually it's a book page that I taped in, and there's like a little sticky frame from postage stamps around it. And this is just two different colored pencils, a white and the dark blue, and then again some paint around it. And this was water-soluble crayon over gesso. A lot of smudging with fingers on the face, and the black crayon. And here I was kind of attempting to draw this hair texture with white gel pen, but it doesn't write so well over a water-soluble crayon. But I think it still shows up decently enough, so you get a feeling that this is actually hair. At least I think so. This is another page of just taping in or gluing in lots of found paper. Now, I had better hopes for this page. This is not actually very good to draw on. Neither is this, but what help? Now, this is a little moth, tiny moth that I found in my studio, so I glued it in. It was already dead. I do not harm animals for art's sake, but when I do find dead animal remains or objects like feathers and stuff, I do pick it up because I do like collecting such stuff. And here in the background, you can see the original writing on the page covered with transparent gesso. So it's a little bleeding a little. It's kind of fuzzy and it looks kind of cool. So what I also learned using this sketchbook is that I do like when writing is kind of just barely visible, like a textural element of the page. When it's something in the background, I don't normally add writing to my pages. It very rarely happens. You might have seen some examples earlier, but honestly, it's just not a thing that I do very often. But I find this kind of cool to just have this very, very barely visible element, especially if it's something that I'm like, I really like how my handwriting looks right here. I was in a like making my handwriting better phase, so I was writing with some nice fountain pens. I mean, I still do, but this was a special fountain pen that is better for script writing. So that I may use that in the future. We'll see about that. And this was another old paperback empty page that I just glued in and doodled a very loose portrait doodle with a brush pen and covered the background with a red brush pen, and then just some shading with a water-soluble pencil. Now this is another one of my favorite spreads. I have both of these on video as a drawing process, so I'm gonna release those as future episodes of Nella's Art Chat. And both of these are basically the same technique of that initial portrait in the very beginning of the sketchbook. Book page, transparent gesso, and then spraying water into the water-soluble crayon so that it kind of drips uncontrollably, and then drawing on top of that with a little more precise, like a more precise portrait. Now this one looks pretty typical of how I normally draw portraits, as opposed to the other one, which was kind of more caricature-y or more stylized. And here I also used a bit of gouache for the moths or the silk moths because I wanted them to stand out as their own object. So that's really when your water-soluble crayons are not opaque enough, then gouache comes to the rescue. And you can still draw over that with a pencil. So I could use Inktense pencil to draw the little feather details. And this is, I believe it's called grattage. It's when you cover the bottom layer with wax or wax pastel. So I always used it as a kid with colorful pastels. So you just draw like a rainbow gradient over the entire paper, then cover it with black gouache or another type of black paint, and then scratch into it with a sharp object. I normally use either a palette knife or like an awl, a very sharp tip, and then you basically scratch out the motive like on a scratch board. So it's like a homemade scratch board, you could say. But I wasn't very inspired, so I was just trying to draw kind of like a waterfall scene. And this, I was just testing out a technique that didn't turn out quite well. And here, a portrait study based on a photo reference with colored pencils. And these are some of the colored pencils that I have, but they are quite opaque. So the original background is this medium gray, and I use or really leaned on heavily onto this blue and black pencil to get it. Okay, looks better without glare. So that looks kind of decent compared to most of my colored pencil drawings they still look kind of very transparent on the background. And this is just kids crayon. So in addition to my fancy Caran d'Ache Neocolor crayons, I also do have some cheapo crayons I bought at the drugstore. And I was just seeing how I could draw over red acrylic background with them. And it looks kind of cool. And even these areas where the little red is showing through it, I think it all makes it look more vibrant, essentially. I'm not sure if you can see that on video, but there is kind of a little bits and pieces of red showing through. But the black really helps with the contrast. So that's that. And we're almost at the end. And these pages are hard to flip over because they sometimes like to fall out. So I was here just testing out some different ways of mixing skin tones. So here is my Neocolor skin tone palette. I'm going to make an entire video on that in the future. So you're going to be able to read what the names of the colors actually are if you want to learn how to make your own portraits with Neocolor. And here I was testing out different medium and dark skin tones, and I'm really happy with the range that I can create with these. And here is just a basic, very, very quick drawing with a water-soluble graphite, something that I haven't really used in years, so I just wanted to see how it looks on this paper, but not so great. And originally you can see some of my old writing here. And that is it from this sketchbook. Now, just final thing that I want to mention is that maybe if you watched my earlier video where I was talking about perfectionism and how this sketchbook is helping me to release perfectionism, you may be wondering how that turned out. Did it actually help me release perfectionism? Good question. Well, I will say that in this particular sketchbook, it did, because I realized I need to have like a beater sketchbook, a sketchbook where I can just go to where I'm not inspired to do anything worthwhile or something that is well thought out. So it really does help to have a place where I can just play and not really have an agenda. So all of these doodled pages where I was basically just filling out the page, I just wanted to complete the sketchbook, and that was the whole point of these doodly pages. So that really helps me to do something when I'm not really in the mood to do anything serious, let's say. But you know, in my other sketchbooks or in my final artwork, I do have a little bit of that perfectionism, and I don't think that will ever go away. But I think it does help in these cases when I just need something really rough to work on. And sometimes I surprise myself, you know, I did not expect some of these pages to look as good as they do. Like, you know, this was a really pleasant surprise. And so that's a, a really happy outcome of having a sketchbook like this. And also now I have to dedicate a different sketchbook to be my beater sketchbook to go to with these just different moods that I have, or just when I want to do something but I don't know what to do. That's basically a mood that I'm frequently in. But also, I learned that I really do like working on blank paper more than anything. So while this was a cool experiment and something that I might experiment with in the future, like I still do like the blank page far more than the colored page. I know a lot of artists love breaking in their sketchbooks with layers of paint and collage so that it doesn't feel like an intimidating blank page. But I love the blank page. I just love the feel of the paper. I work best with mediums that work best on paper, like ink and watercolor and colored pencils and stuff like that, watercolor pencils. So those are not as very useful when when you have a non-porous background such as this. And even when you cover it with watercolor, it's still very difficult to work over that with other colors. So essentially, I couldn't wait to finish this and to go back to my other sketchbooks with a pure paper. And another thing that I've been missing from this sketchbook is the ideas and concepts, like just figuring out ideas for artwork or just letting ideas multiply and merge and stuff that I normally do in my other sketchbooks. So this one is really one page is just more aesthetic or more something to do with the mood that I was in. But normally what I do in my sketchbook is I come up with ideas and then I sketch those ideas, and then those ideas kind of breed into other ideas, and then I have lots of source material for my artwork. And that's kind of the thing that I was missing here, because none of these lend themselves to other artwork. Like it's not inspiring me to go recreate something like a page in this sketchbook and then make it on large on canvas. I'm just missing these ideas and concepts. Like most of these are either doodles or studies, and while they are fun in their own right, they're not that big of a deal in my creative process as these little thumbnail sketches and just sketches in my other sketchbooks are. So overall, I think this was fun. I will definitely keep a lot of the techniques that I've learned here and use them in my art, but also I'm happy that I'm done and that I can go work in my regular sketchbooks in the future. So thank you for watching this video till the very end. Feel free to share your comments and questions. And if you would like to learn how to create a sketchbook similar to this one, technique-wise and purpose-wise, go watch the other video where I explained why I started the sketchbook, how I started it, all the more talk about the perfectionism and playfulness and all of that in that other video. So go check it out, and thanks for sticking around, and I hope to see you again in another video. Bye.